again, today we're very happy to welcome back Dr. Ron Brown. He is continuing his exploration of New York City neighborhoods. He has already brought us to Flushing, to Christopher Street in the Village, to the Lower East Side, and now we're traveling north today up to Harlem. So please join me in giving a warm welcome here to Dr. Ron Brown. Take it away, Ron.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff. Once again, Ron Brown. A lot of you already know me. Those of you who don't, I am a professor of history, political science at Touro College, as you can see on the screen there. And I've been a New York City tour guide for many years and teach New York history and all kinds of wonderful aspects of New York history. Now, it's wonderful being back at the Port Washington Public Library. I included a picture so that you people out in the Long Island don't forget what your library looks like. And Jeff was just told me that they're gradually opening up limited visits. I think he said 25 people. They do have curbside pickup and drop off, which I'm in Queens, and that has been a saving event for me, because just this morning I went down and picked up about 10 or 15 books that arrived and dropped off other books and movies. So the libraries are slowly getting back to life. I don't know when I'll be back at their auditorium, but with free coffee and cookies, but I'm sure this is going to happen shortly. Well, our topic for today is in keeping with this series of talks I've been giving on various aspects of New York history. As Jeff said, we did Christopher Street, the first gay and lesbian neighborhood. We did the Lower East Side. We did Flushing, and these are posted on YouTube. So just go to the Port Washington site, scroll down a little bit, you'll see the symbol for YouTube, and you can either watch them again or watch them for the first time. Today, we're going to be visiting Harlem, but in a rather unique way. We'll give a little bit of the history of African American Harlem, but like every neighborhood, the population doesn't sit still. If you were with me when we did the Lower East Side, we saw that it started out as, in the very early 1800s, it was English and Scottish and North Irish. Then Germans came over, and the Irish Catholics came over. Then it became the Orthodox Jewish Lower East Side, and today it is now a predominantly Chinese and Hispanic neighborhood. So the neighborhoods of New York don't sit still. They're constantly moving forward. In fact, every time I give a talk of about the Lower East Side or do a walking tour for my students at Touro, I always finish up by saying, well, this is where we're at today. Probably the next time I give the talk, Lower East Side is going to be invaded by aliens, little green people who will simply take over the tenements and turn the neighborhood into their own neighborhood. Well, Harlem is in a unique juncture. It is in a process of transforming itself. African American Harlem is fading away, and a new upper class white Harlem is replacing it. So what I'm going to do is just sort of focus on forgetting African American Harlem, but yet trying to remember it. How do we remember some of these parts of a bygone age? Once again, this is the outline. I'll give a little birth and of African American Harlem, stepping back to the late 1800s, flourishing of African American Harlem, and what's happening today. And finally, sanctifying the streets of Harlem, preserving what we can of African American Harlem. Now, the book on the right, you see Into the Soul of African American Harlem, a spiritual walking tour. This is a book which I wrote on the history of Harlem, and I use it in my classes at Touro in African American history, the history of Harlem. So if anybody's interested, just let me know. Okay, so let's get started. African American Harlem. Well, Harlem began as a little settlement in Upper Manhattan. The Dutch founded New Amsterdam, which was at the bottom. You see the picture on the left. You see the wall going across from right to left. That is today Wall Street. Well, the Dutch lived in their little walled city with the Fort Amsterdam at the bottom. But my slide here is a bit hazy, but I'll have to replace that. But you can see the big yellow part and the green parts are the Dutch land claim in North America. The pink area over on the right, you see the hook there, that's the Puritans up in Cape Cod in Massachusetts. At the very bottom left corner, you see what is today Virginia. The green parts were contested, but basically the Dutch claimed what is today Connecticut, Rhode Island, half of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, all of New York State, all of Pennsylvania, all of New Jersey, and all of Delaware, going north to the St. Lawrence River. So the Dutch claimed a huge area. But one of the problems is it's one thing to claim a big area, but if you don't populate it, you will not be able to keep it. So the Dutch started building little settlements all over. We see at the top picture what Harlem, or it was called New Harlem back under the Dutch, and then it became simply Harlem under the English in 1664. But it was a little forested area with a little town on the East River. You see the fishing boats, there's a church there, a couple of houses. And so Harlem began as just a little tiny settlement called New Harlem. In fact, last summer when I was traveling in Holland, I went to Harlem just to say that I had been to the original Harlem. And of course, I visited the original Amsterdam. And so the Dutch, like the English and everybody else, named their new settlements after their homeland. Well, the picture on the left shows Middle Manhattan with what emerged eventually as Central Park. Now, Central Park was built, interestingly, during the Civil War, and it gradually started opening, beginning down at 96th Street, gradually pushing north until it finally got up to 110th Street, the largest urban park entirely within city limits. So Central Park was a major accomplishment. Well, when Central Park was built, 3 new neighborhoods came into existence. The Upper East Side, as you all know, is the wealthy area. The Upper West Side was business people, intellectuals, and whatnot. The area above Central Park became known as Harlem, drawing the name from the little town on the East River, but expanding it to include the whole big area north of Central Park. Well, gradually, Harlem began to grow, and it became distinctive with its, you see the picture on the right, you see the brownstones. So as soon as Harlem was built, and after the Civil War, when people started moving to Harlem, rich New Yorkers and speculators recognized there's money to be made. So when you look at Harlem today and you see all these beautiful rows of brownstones, sometimes you'll see an entire street that is completely identical on both sides, because a speculator bought the street on both sides, mass-produced brownstones, and the upper middle class white people began flowing in. Now, it wasn't the rich people who moved to Harlem, it was the upper middle class. These would be doctors and dentists, bank clerks, clerks in stores. The rich bank owner was, of course, in the Upper East Side. But all of the functionaries, the upper middle class, lawyers, professors, started moving into Harlem beginning after the Civil War, 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. and it became an upper class white neighborhood. Interestingly, it was mixed. Jews and Catholics were welcome, as well as good Protestants of all denominations. So this became a new white neighborhood. On the left, we see Temple Israel, which was the most lavish synagogue built in Harlem. Beautiful Greek style, very much the same today, even though it has become an African American church. On the right, we see also on Lenox Avenue, the Dutch Reformed Church. The old Dutch people, old Dutch families started expanding and moving into this new neighborhood. This, following the Civil War until about 1900, was the golden age of brownstones. Once again, mass produced, because if you buy an entire street and you build 100 identical brownstones, which means you're going to buy 100 front doors. You're going to buy window frames. You're going to buy toilets. You're going to buy pipes and all kinds of stained glass windows. And everybody knows if you go and buy one front door, you're going to pay a price. But if you say, I need 200 identical, what's going to happen to the price? It's going to go down. So Harlem flourished in the golden age of brownstones following the Civil War, especially the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and then moving up to the World War I period. There are even conservation societies which venerate this golden age of brownstones. Well, as always, all good things must pass. So the great economic panic of 1893 hit the United States very, very hard. It was almost as bad as the Great Depression. Banks crumbled. All these big, beautiful rows of brownstones, which were just being built, brand new, latest installations in the kitchen and in the bathroom, were standing empty. So gradually, a neighborhood of Harlem began its historic transition from a great white upper middle class neighborhood to the largest concentration of African Americans in the United States. And Harlem became the largest Black city in the world at a time when the cities of Nigeria and South Africa and Kenya were mere colonial villages. Harlem had the largest Black population concentrated in one area in the world. Now, African American Harlem profited from various events in the late 1800s. First group that moved to Harlem were New York City African Americans. These were the upper class of African Americans who in the late 1800s were living in Hell's Kitchen. And as the name implies, it was not a wonderful place to live. So they started migrating to Harlem. Migrants from Boston and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh gradually heard about Harlem, the emerging Black Mecca, and started moving. Immigrants from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico, from Cuba, from Dominican Republic, from Jamaica, started migrating to this new emerging African city. And as the picture on the right said, the last group to swell the African population of Harlem were migrants from the rural South. If we look at the map, we see from Texas to Virginia and Maryland. During the late 1800s and early 1900s, millions of African Americans migrated north. And so these four population groups transformed Harlem from an upper white middle class neighborhood to a Black neighborhood. Now, the first group were well-to-do New York City African Americans. Now, as I said, they were relegated to the slum areas of Hell's Kitchen. But when they heard about all of these cheap, empty apartments, entire apartment blocks, and entire rows of brownstones, they tentatively started moving to Harlem, mainly up around the 130s and 40s, not down to 110th and 125th, but further north. Well, they had money because there was a well-to-do African American population, as there still is. Business people, professionals, doctors, lawyers, and they were concentrated in the two oldest African American churches in New York, the AME Zion, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion, and Abyssinian Baptist Church. But when they moved to Harlem, by the 1920s, they were ready to build their new church. And in fact, in the case of Abyssinian Baptist, the preacher got up in his rather rundown church in Hell's Kitchen, and he simply ordered them under pain of eternal hellfire, we are moving to Harlem, and you are moving to Harlem with us. So you can see these beautiful churches, which were built by African Americans, by African American architects with African American money. Now, can you imagine importing the stained glass windows from Germany, the organ from Europe, the Carrara marble in the sanctuary from Italy? These were not little churches. These were multi-million-dollar monuments testifying to this group of well-to-do African Americans who gradually started transforming Harlem from an upper middle class white to an African American neighborhood. Another pastor who migrated to Harlem was Sweet Daddy Grace, and he was from the Azores in the Atlantic Ocean. His name was Grace, and which became simply Grace. And he established his own church, the United House of Prayer for All People, during the 1920s. And this is his main sanctuary in Harlem today. It is now a denomination with churches all over the United States, in the Caribbean, and even in Europe. Well, when the Jews and the white people started seeing all these African Americans migrating to Harlem, they gradually started moving away. The Temple Israel on Lenox Avenue, once again, we see it, sold its church to a group of Southern Baptists who were migrating from the South. Now, the story is they sold it for $1. And the condition was you leave it as it is, meaning the Stars of David in the stained glass windows, the Hebrew writing on the inside of the church, these were all preserved until today. Another migrant to Harlem was Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. He migrated there. You see, he held his first public meeting at a Catholic church in 1916, organized the UNIA chapters all across Harlem, New York, and the United States, and even abroad. And so once again, another group of Caribbean islanders started migrating to Harlem and made it into the African American Mecca. W.E.B. Du Bois founded the NAACP in 1909 in Boston, moved the whole thing to Harlem in the early 1900s as Harlem was emerging as the major African American city of the world. Well, some people resisted the Black migration to Harlem. And as right, we see the Blumstein's department store on 125th Street. Well, Mr. Blumstein and his son had no love for Black people. I mean, they were good Reform Jews and simply thought that Harlem should remain Jewish and white. Well, they resisted the African arrival tooth and nail. Well, it was in November and October that Adam Clayton Powell of Abyssinian Baptist Church said, he lets us shop there, but he won't hire Black people to work in his store. So Adam Clayton Powell started a protest in front of the store and said, don't shop where you can't work. Well, this really brought Mr. Bloomstein to his knees, and gradually he said, all right, I'll start hiring Black people. Well, Adam Clayton Powell said, well, yes, but we don't want people washing windows and scrubbing the floors. We want girls at the cash register. We want people in the office. And Mr. Bloomstein agreed reluctantly, and the building is still there. And interestingly, it's owned by Touro College now. It's our College of Dentistry and various science and medical professions. The sign is gone, unfortunately, but it is a part of the African population of Harlem. Of course, all of this climaxed with the Harlem Renaissance, an explosion of music, of culture, of art, of poetry, of dance. During the 1920s, remember, the United States had won World War I. We were at the top of the world. Businesses were booming throughout the 20s. African Americans migrated by the tens of thousands to Harlem, and the majority of the migrants to Harlem, whether they were upper class New York African Americans or from other states or from the Caribbean, they were young people. They got jobs in New York, and they may work at a lousy job all week long, but when they got their pay on Friday, they were experiencing and contributing to the Harlem Renaissance, the outburst of culture and music. A major part of the Harlem Renaissance was the Roaring Twenties. Roaring because it was loud, it was trumpets, liberated women, no longer wearing corsets and their hair up in pins, but they were liberated. The Apollo Theater was in its heyday. Duke Ellington and his band coming up, performing in music. The Cotton Club, interestingly, was one of the greatest venues for African-American artists and musicians, but the audience was white only. But yet, during the 20s, it was a cultural center. I love that sign on the right, where you can go to the Cotton Club and have a great time, and dinner was $1.50. There was even a 5-cent sign back then. Back in those good days, I mean, even Nathan's hot dog out of Coney Island was still 5 cents. So this was the flowering of African-American culture. Well, unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. Just like the white and Jewish Harlem gave way to the Black Harlem beginning in the late 1800s and up into the 1920s and 30s. Today, Harlem is once again a neighborhood becoming a white neighborhood. Now, as you can see on the sign on the right, work in progress, you see apartment buildings are replacing the brownstones. Giant bookstores are lining 125th Street, 110th Street. Entire neighborhoods are being demolished. Prices are going through the ceiling, which means well-to-do white people are moving in, and the African Americans who suffered severely during the Great Depression are now being forced out. Just walking around Harlem to make a lot of these pictures, which we're going to see, these are all my pictures. I mean, I walk around, I see something, I take a picture, such as that sign on the left. I don't even remember what street it was, but it was off of Lenox Avenue, if it's 120. Harlem not for sale, fight back. There is a big resistance movement, but nobody stands in the face of real estate developers, whether it was John Jacob Astor back in the 1800s or Donald Trump today. real estate speculation is rife. Millions of dollars are being made. Now, of course, nobody comes out and says we are destroying African American Harlem. The catchphrase is urban renewal. I mean, tearing down a bunch of old buildings, building these big, beautiful buildings, as you see on the right. Well, how are we going to remember the golden age of African American Harlem, or is it going to be forgotten? Think walking around the Lower East Side, I did a tour with some friends who were visiting. Half of the buildings, which I used to point out as hearkening back to the Irish or the German or the Orthodox Jewish periods of the Lower East Side, most of them are now gone and they're replaced by buildings, as we can see in the picture. Every neighborhood is changing. Well, there are a few signs left of Harlem. Some people are taking a concern in preserving Harlem. The picture on the right, there's yours truly. You can see it's during the pandemic when I went there to take these pictures. But this is in front of the Apollo, where to preserve the African American chapter of the Apollo's history, the artists who performed there and who gained fame there are being immortalized in the sidewalk. Now, don't forget, the Apollo was an all-white theater for decades, and it became an African-American theater with its famous Wednesday night amateur nights. Now it is going back to being just a regular theater for shows and everything, but the sidewalk preserves its African-American chapter. Another thing that you don't see, and there's no memory of, are the many Black Hebrews who would use the street as a preaching area. So many of the African American preachers, many of which went on later to develop their own churches and denominations. Sweet Daddy Grace, he didn't always have his big, beautiful 125th Street cathedral. He started out preaching on a street corner. Well, this is all being lost. The many preachers, such as the Black Hebrews, are basically no longer in Harlem. Every once in a while, you'll be walking along and you'll see a street preacher, but they are going to be part of the forgotten chapter of African American Harlem. This was a church which I used to visit a long time ago. It's named Downtown Baptist Church on Lenox Avenue. And you can see it was an old regular brownstone of some sort that they just enclosed the front lobby. And it was called the Downtown Baptist Church. Well, as you can see, that picture I have of it is one of the very last pictures of it. A friend of mine, Kayla Tello, happened to be walking by with her camera, and she recorded the demolition of this church. Once again, a chapter of Harlem history which has disappeared. And in fact, if you would like to view this really tragic video, you can go to Facebook and you can find it. As Jeff said, this PowerPoint presentation, Zoom presentation, will be shortly posted on the library website. And so you'll be able to view this program and even log on to the Facebook program. Chronicling this chapter that is long gone. It's now replaced by a big giant apartment building because the people had moved away. The African Americans were priced out. Their real estate value of this lot just skyrocketed. They could no longer maintain it, and it was sold. And what happened to the pastor, the history of this congregation is also long lost. Another chapter which has disappeared, but the building remains. These are the Commandment Keepers Synagogue. This is at 1 West 123rd Street, right near Mount Morris Park. The first time I went, I saw the picture on the right. And you see the door. It's going to a beautiful apartment building where they had taken over a couple floors and made it into an African American synagogue. Now, they claim to be authentic Orthodox Jews, although they were never accepted by the major Orthodox organizations, but they developed their own form of Black Judaism. Picture on the left, I was there not too long ago, and you see that the star in the doorway is gone. There's just a little window there, and the whole front is boarded up with plywood. And you can see on the second floor, on the middle of the picture there, you can see the windows where the synagogue was is all boarded up. So once again, another chapter of African American Harlem that is gone. This shows the gradual attempt to survive. This is the Christ Temple House of Prayer Deliverance Church on Lenox Avenue at 130th Street. They have been doing the impossible to survive. A small congregation, but yet as of a couple months ago when I was there last, it is still functioning. On the left, we see the first time I visited back in the early 1990s. And then they spruced it up a little bit and they added some more decorations up at the top. But you can see in both of the pictures, the lot to the right of the building is empty. Well, the last time I went, just about a month ago, this was the new facade which they're putting on the old church. And they're building a skyscraper beside it. Now, one thing which New York has, I don't know if it applied in this case, but if you have a small building like this, and the area where it is located is zoned, maximum height of a building is 10 stories, basically you own the air above your building, and you can sell that air that you're not using to the building beside it. So the building beside it can add another 4 or 5 floors to its skyscraper, and you can get millions of dollars. St. Patrick's did that, got millions of dollars to build a giant skyscraper right beside it. But it used those millions of dollars to completely restore and clean the church. So some churches are desperately trying to survive, but as is often the case, the congregation moves away. I've gone to some of these little chapels in their last years, and there would be an elderly pastor with a half a dozen elderly people, but all the young people have moved to Brooklyn or Jamaica or Long Island or even New Jersey as Harlem is being transformed. This is another church which manages to survive. I see in the early 90s, this is what it looked like, still in relatively good shape, but this is what it was earlier this summer. And you can see a brand new building going up on the right, a big building behind it. I mean, buildings completely surrounding it. So you can imagine the value of this real estate. Now, the church might own it, but in a case like this, only the first floor will actually be a church, and they'll rent out the apartments above it. So they have to pay real estate taxes. So you can imagine how difficult it is for a lot of these churches to survive. And this is going to be a candidate for gradual disappearance, in my opinion, but it is managing to survive. But once again, when it is gone, nobody will remember it. Maybe a few old people will remember going to church services there, but once it is gone, the younger people will only have a faint memory, and a history of Harlem built around a congregation, a charismatic founding preacher, will disappear. Now, these churches, like the Antioch Church of God in Christ, most of these are independent. Many of them belong to loose organizations, but they don't have a big bishop somewhere in lower Manhattan or Chicago who can pour money into preserving these little churches. This is another one which I visited. This is called the Progressive Baptist Church over on 126th Street at St. Nicholas Avenue. And I love to see the close-up. For example, you see the sign is gradually withering away with the heat and the humidity. The plaster and the cement is beginning to deteriorate. The door is boarded up gradually, and you can see in this building on the right and on the left, the buildings are long gone. They're empty, rubbish-strewn lots. And probably if I go back in a month or two, this building will be gone and replaced by a big 10 or 20-story apartment building. Once again, another chapter lost. There's another one, St. Catherine's Church. You can see that it is not even functioning anymore, and it is probably just waiting to be sold. Gospel Temple Church of Christ on the right. You can see the upper floors were burned out. The basement is still operating as a little chapel, but the front door is condemned, and gradually this will be sold. Now you can imagine a nice brownstone like this with a restored brownstone on the right, another one on the left, which is in good condition. This could go for up to $1 million. And so it will, once again, two congregations, two chapters in the history of Harlem are gone. New Pilgrim Baptist Church. Once again, we see a couple of signs which are still there in the early 90s. When I went back the last time this summer, we see what it is today. The churches are gone. The stained glass window is gone. The signs are gone, and they are now nicely restored brownstones. Many of these are occupied by one or two families. And if you go to a real estate agent, you can see what the prices are for some of these. So once again, a chapter gone. Who remembers Reverend John Davis, his senior pastor? A once vibrant congregation is now largely forgotten. Another church where the sign is still there, fading away, the Shiloh Kingdom Deliverance International Ministries, also on Lenox Avenue, completely shuttered. The sign probably will be removed eventually, and it will be restored to a brownstone. But even the name, wonder, what charismatic preacher attracted a congregation and named it not only Shiloh Kingdom Deliverance, but International Ministries, such aspirations, such dreams, which are now largely forgotten, if not totally forgotten. Interestingly, there were many women preachers in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and later. Here we see the Gethsemane Revival Holiness Center on 125th Street. Founder, elect lady D.B. Stevens, pastor, her daughter Patricia Stevens, all are welcome. That's what it was in the early 90s. Look on the right. That is the hole with a giant apartment block going up on a right, another building going up behind it, and probably the next time I go back, the building to the left will also be gone, and another skyscraper will be going up. But this is a fascinating chapter of Harlem history because most churches did not allow women to preach. Mainstream churches, Baptists were opposed to women preachers, but many women went into what they call revival churches and holiness churches, where women preachers were really given free rein to gather a following. Now, back in the 20s, this is before there were women reform rabbis or women Episcopal preachers. This was one of the few refuges of African American women. This is another one founded by a woman. This is the Bethlehem Pentecostal Assembly on the left, Mount Horeb Holiness Church of God on the right, both founded and pastored by women. But you can see they are trying to keep the one on the left, the Bethlehem Pentecostal Assembly, alive. But once again, the upper floors, windows are broken, boarded up. They put up a sign to celebrate their anniversary, but every Sunday I went back, there was no activity. The one on the right still has the sign, the Holiness Church of God. They painted the door and the stoop, but it is probably on its last legs as well. The spiritualists, which welcomed women. Once again, this building is now back to its origin as a apartment building. The Botanica, the spiritual reader, healer, advisor, are also gone. On the right, the big factory building on 8th Avenue, which was the Masjid Aqsa, founded by African Muslims who started migrating, that is also gone, part of history. Mount Carmel Baptist Church, I see the transition here. The last time I went, the church was closed, but the sign was still there. The next time I went back, the plastic was still on the windows to imitate the cross in stained glass, but the sign was gone. Again, a chapter of Harlem history long forgotten. Holy Cross African Orthodox Pro-Cathedral. Once again, we see it when I visited. I even went to church there. This was the denomination founded by Marcus Garvey as an independent Black church. You can see the name, Holy Cross African Orthodox Church. When I went back a couple of months ago, the church was boarded up. The front was covered with trash, and it hadn't been opened in a long time. Perfectly, I could go back another time, and it would be either demolished or restored as a $1 million apartment. This is the new Ebenezer Baptist Church on 5th Avenue. You see the sign gradually deteriorating, still up there, but once again, showing the gradual transition of the neighborhood. The one on the right, that was an old storefront church that had closed. You can see it's all locked up. But somebody took a hymn book and left it out front with one of the pictures from the wall. Sort of the last silent tribute to the days when this building on 5th Avenue had a major congregation. Now, there have been attempts to sanctify the streets of Harlem, not just the building. When Elder Clayhorn Martin arrived in New York and in Harlem from his native Virginia, he got down, kissed the ground in Harlem, kissed the street and the sidewalk, and said, "This is holy ground." And he swore that he would never let shoes keep him from touching the sacred ground of Harlem. And when someone asked him why you were walking the streets of Harlem day and night, winter and summer, with no shoes on, he said, because like God told Moses to take off his shoes, because he is walking on sacred ground, God also appeared to him and said, "This is sacred ground." Father Divine Story, another person who rose, who flourished, who had some of the largest churches in Harlem, passed away, and nothing remains of his church. but he was one of the great street preachers. In fact, what he would do is he'd have his mass baptisms. Well, the streets were the places for his baptisms. He would take a fire hydrant, hook up a hose, and he washed away a multitude of sins into the sewers of the streets of Harlem. Saints were made on the streets of Harlem, and once again, nothing is left except a few books, Jill Watts, but so many of these chapters of Harlem history have left no remains behind. Now, a way recently that the government has been trying to preserve some of the history is giving street names to numbered streets. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard is 125th Street. Lenox Avenue is now Malcolm X Boulevard. So this is a way that the city government is attempting to preserve some of the history. So while they tear down a lot of the buildings that have historical associations with African American Harlem, they are making a rather small effort to preserve some of the memories through street names. On the left is the statue of Reverend Adam Clayton Powell of Abyssinian Baptist. This is on 125th Street. So sort of ironic that behind it is the Adam Clayton Powell State Office building, which demolished an entire city block of Harlem history, but yet they put up a statue honoring Adam Clayton Powell. Once again, the person who led demonstrations, forced Bloomsteins to start hiring African Americans. And in fact, he forced Bloomstein to hire the first Black Santa Claus. First Black Santa Claus, known Black Santa Claus in the United States, was at Bloomstein's department store. On the right, a immigrant from Africa created this sculpture, which is at 5th Avenue and 120th Street. Once again, in front of an entire block of historic brownstones, which were torn down, stores which were torn down, storefront chapels which were torn down, but yet they do try to preserve a little bit of the history through a modern depiction of 3 African American women. The Duke Ellington Memorial at 110th Street once again preserves some of the musical history of the city, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Towers in 110th Street, a whole housing complex, once again named after Martin Luther King, preserving a bit of the history of the civil rights movement in Harlem. Now, another fascinating way that some people are trying to preserve the history of African American Harlem is through street art. And here we see one of the most celebrated street artists who's made a great contribution to Harlem is Lance Estos Bradley. We see a picture of him on the right. He paints street murals. Now, this is on the side of a building. Now, how long they're going to last, I don't know. But you can see from this, it was up here as of this summer when I last photographed it. You see Papa and Mama. It was a family that hired Estos, as he goes by the name, to paint a memorial to a Harlem family, Papa and Mama and the 6 kids. And here again, how long is it going to last? Well, who knows? This building could be demolished. Storms will destroy it. But here again, it is an effort to preserve some of the history of Harlem. Another street painter is Paul Dale. This is his famous mural called Planet Harlem, talking about depicting the sports stars, the dancers, the singers, the artists, the poets. And you can see it's on the side of a regular building. I mean, the bricked up window is still there. You see all the decorations at the bottom. But here again, how long it will last, trying to keep some of the history of Harlem. The guy going up in the middle is Adam Clayton Powell Jr., one of the minister at Abyssinian Baptist Church. Louis Delsart, the Spirit of Harlem. This is right across the street from the Apollo Theater. Now you can see this was commissioned by a bank. Actually, that's not the correct word, because he painted the street mural depicting Harlem scenes. When the bank bought the building, it covered over the mural. And there was such an outburst of anger that the bank restored the mural, and it is now being preserved. So here again, this is an attempt to preserve a chapter of Harlem, African American history, even though the area is being gentrified. So that brings us to an end of preserving history. So those of you who haven't seen me in a while, this is what I used to look like when I was taking all these pictures in the early 90s and of Harlem. If anybody has any comments or anything, they can always contact me at ronbrownmedia@gmail.com. That's easy to remember. Now, the theme that we're talking about is preserving Harlem. It's only recently that historic preservation has become a major issue. I'm sure you can all remember the picture on the right, the old Penn Station, which was torn down, totally demolished, one of the greatest scandals of New York history. But this tragedy did inspire the various New York City, New York State, and national historic preservation movements. And so Harlem is being preserved to an extent. But here again, it depends on people to say this theater, this church, this building is of historic value. And so historic preservation is really a challenge to all of us, whether we live in Queens or in the city or in Long Island, where a lot of historic buildings are also facing demolition. So I have reached my almost 1 o'clock time limit.